Hello, welcome back to the shed. In today's video I want to show you how to correctly use both the wheel and the standard vintage style marking gauge. Hope you enjoy. So this video is a continuation on this beginner series of how to use your tools correctly, especially your marking and layout tools, and then we'll move on to some of the more advanced tools and how to use them correctly a little bit in the future. So today we're tackling the marking gauges. So let me bring you in here and we'll tackle the traditional style first, because that takes a little more work and effort to operate than the old wheel gauge. So jump in and I'll talk you through it. For the sake of today's little demo on this, we're going to pretend that we're going to be marking a gap that's roughly yay wide. The width doesn't matter in this particular instance, down the side of this board. I'm going to say that we're going to do 15mm gap. So with these traditional style gauges, now I don't have a cutting gauge, and the difference between these traditional style that we've got here and a cutting gauge is this one has a pin which you can sharpen that makes a sharp strike on your board. Now this just happens to be a nail smacked in here and then sharpened up a little bit. And if you have a cutting gauge, you actually have a blade there, and they work better going across the grain usually than down the grain. A pin style like this will work down the grain better than a knife, because the knife will follow the grain, whereas a nail like this will just scratch in. Now the main difference between this style and your wheel style is obviously the wheel style is in a wheel shape, and the wheel style has a cutter like this which is flat on this side and just an angle back on one side. Whereas with the pin, if you caught my video on the knife, you're going to have the same effect using this pin, because you're going to get a V gouge in your wood versus a nice flat line like you're going to get with these ones. But first of all, we're going to tackle how we set up these vintage style. Now, you want to make sure you're taking your marking from the tip of the pin. Now in this case, I've tried to eyeball it roughly where we want it, and I'm going to use a ruler on top like this, line it up with it, and then we're going to just slowly move it with our thumb. You can do these little pinch movements. It just allows it to move just a tiny amount. And then when I think I've got it lined up, we're going to lock down that fence. But you can actually set these and move them a little bit by tapping that way and tapping that way. And even with that done up, it's going to tap it and move in a micro amount. So I'm just going to double check that this is still on our 15mm. And it's actually a little bit under, so I need to make it a little bit longer. So if I give one swift tap like that, oh, it's gone too far. Bring it back with the tap like that. And you can see that that pin is lining up dead on it. So that's how we set our gauges. Now in using these style, I'm just going to zoom back out, you want to hold these boards so they don't move, and you want to reference right up on them. Now to do that, I like to set it in my hand like this and just loosely grab it. So I'm putting weight on the front of the stock here, on the back of the stock, and just holding. And then it allows me to come in and actually reference and hold that tight up against my board, because obviously this is your fence, so you want that to be referenced tight up against it. Now, you could come straight in like this, but you can see that's getting stuck, and it's going to leave a big ugly gouge, and it's going to run on the grain. So what you want to do is come in and roll it until the point just touches. So if you see here, I'm just hitting that until it just references. So let's find a clean spot. Reference up is barely touching. And you want to run like that. Lightly a few times. Now when it comes to any style of marking gauge, you want to make sure that you're doing a bunch of light passes and not one big heavy pass. And now if I find a pencil, I've run a few lines in there, and that's got a nice heavy marking line there. and we can say that it stayed straight and we've marked it. It's not gouged right in, it's marked it exactly how we want it under control. Similarly with these style, if you're trying to find a middle of a section, you can actually come in, mark a point like that, come in, mark a point like that. So we've got a point here and a point here, and you can slowly adjust that and keep tapping it a little bit until you find the center of your board, eyeballing it like this, and then you make a couple more little dots and you keep working it out until you find the center, and then you're actually doing little taps like that to try and make sure as you come in from each side, and eventually you'll end up with one dot that's in the middle, and you know that's the center of your board. And that's another advantage with these pin ones. It's a little more tricky to do with the wheel style gauge. So now I'm going to move on to the wheel style gauge. And when it comes to the wheel style gauge, we have ones with 2 screws like this one happens to have, and this one's got a little micro adjusting collar, so it allows you to adjust it a little bit easier than the ones with the single screw on them. And because these have got a double screw, they're less likely to move, whereas I've found every type of the single style, just the screw that they tend to move. So if you can, find one like this, but I know these ones tend to be more expensive. This one was from the Cat's Moses store. I'll leave that link down below, and I've been pretty happy with it. I've not had any sliding or movement in them. I don't know whether anyone else has used them and had any issues, but for me, they've worked really well. So as I mentioned before, these wheel marking gauges are different because they have a round cutting head here, flat edge here, and then one cut back against it. So you end up with a triangular cut on your board with the triangle on the waste side and the flat side on the side that you want to keep. So it's very accurate. And since it cuts, they excel for going across the board. They're not quite as good for going along the board. I prefer the pin style for that, but you can use them for both. If we look at this style here, this one actually has graduations on here, so you can take your markings straight on it as long as they're accurate. Now, on this one they are accurate, and you can test that by bringing a ruler in and then checking to make sure that those markings are accurate before you go ahead and just use those markings. I still like to double check with a ruler because I'm used to it, but these markings on here are accurate. Now locked down on 17mm. All I've done is done up this back thread here. Now I can adjust this collar here and move it up like this, so we can see that the back here is fixed and that head is just moving, and we can micro adjust it right down to when it gets to our 15mm like that, and then you lock that head down. Now after I've done that, just to ensure this doesn't move, I like to undo that back one, close that up so there's no slop, and then you've got the double screw pushing and holding that head and not pushing against the thread. And that's how you set these ones with the double screw. If you've just got it with the single screw, it's obviously very similar. You just don't have the micro adjuster, so you might want to partially lock the screw down and then pinch move it like I showed you with the other one. You can pinch move these as well, just to get little tiny adjustments until you get it and then lock it down. But you do want to make sure the ones with the single screw on the head that don't have the adjustments are done up nice and tight so it doesn't move. But I find most of them do tend to move a little bit, so if you're doing multiple lines with the one marking gauge, I double check it as you go to make sure it's not moving. Now with these style, when you're marking, you come up and you're obviously referencing flat this face, and you do have a smaller fence with these, so they're a little bit harder to reference, and I like to kind of hold up around the head like that and just grab around the shaft just so I know it's referencing properly, and then you can pull them like that. Again, a couple of light passes and then a heavier pass. So let me just bring them in closer just so you can see this. So we come in, Obviously we've already got that line there now. And this one doesn't move, so you can go actually in both directions. You can see how it gets a very nice clean line. If we run a pencil in this, we can see that it's actually got a cleaner line on this inside than the pin gives you here. Now you might have to make allowances for that if you're using that pin style versus the cutting wheel style, where you know that you're going to be dead accurate and you've got a nice square line on the inside of that. So you've got a nice reference to work to. The other advantage of the wheel gauge versus the pin gauge is if we set this down onto a small amount like this, and we're going to reference on the edge of the board, as you get to the edge here, I'll find you have a problem with it sort of dropping away. With this style, you can see I actually, when I run that along, I actually undercut on this side here. Luckily that was on the waist side, but it pulled off the line just here because it rode. And we can also see that it's not the neatest in cleaners. It's kind of dragged it and actually damaged the fibers a little bit and pulled them, which is not ideal. So when I'm doing these edges with this one, I like to come in and reference, and I sit the gauge just sort of halfway on the edge, and I actually mark that corner first. So I've nipped that in first, and that's kind of engaging my blade so it doesn't want to slide. And then from there I run right up until I'm almost on the edge here, and then I roll the gauge onto the corner, and that gives me my marking right to that corner. And if we look here, we can see that this is a much finer line. I did still crush the fibers a little bit here, but there's much less than I got with the pin. Now that is partially because my wheel gauge, and this is a problem with these gauges, they tend to be a little bit weak, and you can see that there's a little bit of chipping around the edge here where it's actually broken, and that's why you want to make sure you keep a lot of spares of these, because these corners are very weak, and especially on hardwoods they tend to chip out when you're using them, and then you're not going to get an accurate cut with these gauges. Now I'll show you in an upcoming video how we actually sharpen these, because you want to keep them sharp as well, and it's vital for them to work properly that they stay sharp. So there you have it, folks. That's how you use both the traditional pin style and also the wheel gauge. I didn't mention how to use the Mortise Gauge because essentially it's the same, and with this one these pins here are just controlled using the little thread here. Some of them have a little slider, but it's essentially the same operation. So if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing down here so I can get this video out to more people to help them out like you. And if you want to support me a little bit further, please consider checking me out on Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/aussiewoodshed. Links in the description below. And if you like this video and you'd like to see some more videos like these tip videos that I'm showing you here, please check out the videos on the screen here right now. Bye for now.